During the next half an hour, we are going to be discussing Virginia Woolf's novel Mrs Dalloway. As you probably know, Virginia Woolf was a novelist, short story writer, essayist and publisher. She was born Adeline Virginia Stephen in 1882 in London. Her father, Leslie Stephen, was a famous Victorian man of letters. Her mother was born in India. Her name was Julia, but soon she migrated to England. Virginia and her siblings, including the children from their parents' earlier marriages, grew up in an environment saturated by the Victorian literary influences. Her brothers were sent to Cambridge, but the daughters of the family were not. Later, Virginia Woolf was to write on the cultural, economic and intellectual constraints from which the women of the period suffered because of the patriarchal system. The family spent its summers in the seaside town of Cornwall. These memories form the basis of Virginia Woolf's novel To the Lighthouse. Her mother had a sudden death in 1895. This is said to be the beginning of the many nervous breakdowns she suffered throughout her life. She suffered from frequent attacks of depression and she had to be committed to an institution for a brief time. In 1912, she married Leonard Woolf. They shared a very close bond. They also collaborated professionally. With her husband's support, Virginia Woolf started the Hogarth Press, which first published many of her novels. She was also involved in a lesbian relationship with writer Beta Sackville West. Virginia Woolf is associated with the famous Bloomsbury Group. The group consisted of intellectuals and artists who shared certain common tastes and ideas on art and life. Apart from the Woolfs, the prominent members of the group included art critic Roger Fry, writer and critic Lytton Strachey, novelist E.M. Forster, and the economist J.M. Keynes. Under the influence of the philosopher G.E. Moore, many members of the group got interested in states of feeling. In Virginia Woolf's novels, we find an accurate representation of delicate emotional states. Virginia Woolf's literary career began with writing of reviews and essays for the Times Literary Supplement. She had distinct views on art, especially on the craft of fiction. These ran counter to the school of fiction called social realism as practiced by John Galsworthy, Arnold Bennett and H.G. Wells. She explained her ideas on fiction in many essays, in particular Modern Fiction and Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Brown. She was particularly interested in the representation of characters with greater focus upon the inner reality of these characters than upon their outward behavior, external features or social position. Many members of Bloomsbury Group were admirers of avant-garde art. This is particularly true of Clive Bell, art critic, the person to whom Virginia Woolf's sister Vanessa had got married. The term avant-garde is a military metaphor meaning advance guard. It is used to denote art which is radically experimental and innovative. The term avant-garde is used interchangeably with another term, modernism. Modernism refers to a number of movements and tendencies in different arts. The common characteristics of modernism include disenchantment with traditional forms of artistic expression, radical experimentation, and questioning of norms. In the words of D.H. Lawrence, modernism showed the world the possibility of living without believing in the official version of reality. The early features of modernism became apparent towards the end of 19th century, but the movement reached its climax between the two world wars, that is between 1918 and 1939. The major modernist writers in English are Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot in poetry, James Joyce, Virginia Woolf, and D.H. Lawrence in fiction. Woolf's major novels include The Voyage Out, 1915, Night and Day, 1919, Jacob's Room, 1922, Mrs. Dalloway, 1925, To the Lighthouse, 1927, Orlando, 1928, Waves, 1931, and Between the Acts, 1941. Her novels are experimental in several ways. Most of these novels are psychological in approach and employ the technique called stream of consciousness. In this kind of writing, the author focuses upon the minds of characters rather than upon their outward behavior. Woolf's novels concentrate on the everyday and the commonplace. They are intensely receptive to the visual and auditory impressions of ordinary life. In 1940, Virginia Woolf's London house was bombed in the German Blitzkrieg. In the following year, she fell into a state of depression and drowned herself at the age of 59. Today, she is considered one of the greatest novelists of the 20th century and one of the foremost modernists. The surge of feminist criticism in the 1970s also established her as a writer who articulated women's concerns, especially the problems faced by women writers. The novel Mrs. Dalloway was published in 1925. After writing for more than a decade, Virginia Woolf seemed to have discovered a new literary form capable of expressing the changing reality of post-war England. The novel depicts the subjective experiences and memories of its central characters over the course of a single day in post-World War I London. In focusing upon the occurrences of a single day, Mrs. Dalloway is similar to James Joyce's Ulysses, which is also about a day in the life of the protagonist Leopold Bloom. Mrs. Dalloway is a rather short novel. It is divided into parts rather than chapters. It is intertextually created from two of Virginia Woolf's short stories, namely Mrs. Dalloway in Bond Street and The Unfinished, the Prime Minister. It would be a bit paradoxical to look for a plot in Mrs. Dalloway. Virginia Woolf was disappointed with realist fiction and viewed its neat and linear plots as an inadequate form of expression. Her objective was to capture the inner spirit of life, or the essential reality as retrieved through the impressions saturating the human mind. She says metaphorically, life is not a series of gig lamps symmetrically arranged. Life is a luminous halo, a semi-transparent envelope surrounding us from the beginning of consciousness to the end. Characters in Mrs. Dalloway occasionally perceive life's pattern or the reality of existence in what Virginia Woolf called moments of being. However, Mrs. Dalloway has a series of events and characters' impressions which may be gathered together under the rubric of a plot. Clarissa Dalloway, a middle-aged woman, goes around London making preparations for a party which she is to host that evening. The nice day reminds her of her youth in Burton. She thinks about her youth, then she wonders about her choice of husband. She married a reliable Richard Dalloway instead of an enigmatic and unpredictable Peter Walsh. She could not be with Sally Seaton, a girl with whom she had a relationship in her youth. Peter Walsh visits her in the morning, and this reintroduces many conflicts into her mind. Another character, Septimus Warren Smith, appears in the novel now. Septimus is a veteran of the First World War. He is suffering from shell shock, or what is called in psychological terms deferred traumatic stress. He spends his day in the park with his Italian-born wife Lucrezia. The way in which Virginia Woolf establishes connections among characters is quite interesting. Septimus Warren Smith and his wife Lucrezia are seen by Peter Walsh. Similarly, Sir William Bradshaw, the psychiatrist who treats Septimus Warren Smith, is a guest at Clarissa's party. Septimus experiences indecipherable hallucinations, mostly concerning his dear friend Evans, who died in the war. Later that day, he is prescribed involuntary commitment to a psychiatric hospital, but he commits suicide jumping out of a window. In the evening, at the party, Clarissa meets many people, including characters from her past. This includes Peter Walsh and Sally Seton. From Bradshaw, she hears about Septimus's suicide. Of course, Septimus is a stranger to Clarissa, but she admires this act of the stranger because she feels that the suicide was an attempt on the part of Septimus to preserve the purity of his happiness. Let me also mention in this connection another more recent work which is intertextually based on Virginia Woolf and her novel Mrs Dalloway. It is Michael Cunningham's 1998 novel The Hours. The book deals with three women whose situations are similar to those of Virginia Woolf or her characters in Mrs Dalloway. The Hours was adapted into a film by Stephen Daldry. Virginia Woolf is keen on showing her characters in a state of flux rather than as static entities. They think and feel as they move through space and react to the surroundings as people do in real life. It is their impressions which we have in the place of conventional presentations of character. With this qualification, let us look at the major characters of Mrs Dalloway. Clarissa Dalloway is the protagonist of the novel. She is married to Richard Dalloway and has a daughter, Elizabeth Dalloway. In the course of the day, we find her making preparations for a party which she is to host that evening. The novel is about her struggle to balance her inner life with the requirements of the external world. Though she is immersed in the fads of high-class society, she probes for meaning beneath its glittery surfaces. This gives her character a certain degree of emotional and existential profundity which many other characters lack in the novel. She thinks about death, aging, and the passion which she sacrificed for a comfortable upper-class life. Richard Dalloway is her husband. From Clarissa's thoughts, we come to know that he is a haughty person and the two do not share any emotional bond. Of course, he is hardworking and sensible, but he lacks sensitivity to the beauty and depth of life which his wife possesses. Sally Seton is a former lesbian love interest of Clarissa. She was an uninhibited person, a kind of youthful ragamuffin. She is married in the present of the novel and has 5 sons. Still, she has not changed much. She is still somebody who can be called a loose cannon. Clarissa is so close to her heart that she puts her friend before her husband and children while counting blessings. For Clarissa too, the moment when Sally Seton kissed her on her lips is the one true moment of passion in her life. Peter Walsh is an old friend of Clarissa's. She had rejected his marriage proposal. He is planning to marry Daisy. He still feels the loss of Clarissa, but he is unable to decide what to do with his feelings. He weeps in Clarissa's presence. His stormy and indecisive character makes him a foil to a calm and stable Richard Dalloway. Walsh appears to be a person incapable of commitment, and being a kind of drifter, he feels that he has wasted his life. The shortcomings of his personal and social condition make Peter Walsh critical of Clarissa's bourgeois lifestyle. But despite all this, he is able to feel life deeply. Hugh Whitbread is a pompous friend of Clarissa's. He is extremely conscious of his social position. But many characters, including Clarissa and Richard, consider him obnoxious. The Dalloways and their friends represent the upper class London society. As opposed to them, people like Septimus Warren Smith represent a different class. Septimus Warren Smith hails from the working class. He is a war veteran. He leads a terrible life. Suffering from shell shock, he has frequent hallucinations, most of them surrounding his friend Evans, who was killed in action. He is isolated from society and lives in a world of his own. He has even grown psychologically distant from his wife, Lucrezia. Lucrezia was born in Italy. She had married Septimus Warren Smith after the armistice. She is burdened by her husband's illness. She also feels homesick for her country and family. So William Bradshaw is a psychiatrist who treats Septimus Warren Smith. Bradshaw typifies the insensitive medical professional who objectifies his patients. Miss Kilman, another character in the novel, is Elizabeth's history teacher. She was fired from a teaching job during the war. She resents the upper class and its etiquette. For example, she dislikes getting dressed up for others. Of German ancestry, she is a born-again Christian. Like the other modernists, Virginia Woolf believed that traditional modes of representation in Victorian fiction were inadequate to convey a changing reality. Her special emphasis is on the subjective states of human existence, or inner reality. Look at this statement from her novel, Jacob's Room. It's not catastrophes, murders, deaths, diseases that age and kill us. It's the way people look and laugh and run up the steps of omnibuses. The statement conveys the tragedy of everyday life. The novel Mrs Dalloway employs what is called the stream of consciousness technique of narration. Stream of consciousness was a phrase used by the American philosopher and psychologist William James in his book The Principles of Psychology. James uses the term to describe the unbroken flow of perceptions, thoughts and feelings in a person's mind. It is the British novelist May Sinclair who adopted it to denote a narrative method in fiction. As used in modernist fiction, stream of consciousness is a mode of narration that undertakes to reproduce, without a narrator's intervention, the full spectrum and continuous flow of a character's mental process, including conscious and half-conscious thoughts, memories, expectations, feelings, and random associations. The term is often used interchangeably with another term, interior monologue. Many high modernist writers employ the stream of consciousness technique in their works. James Joyce uses it in Ulysses and A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. Virginia Woolf in Mrs Dalloway and To the Lighthouse, and William Faulkner in The Sound and the Fury. In Mrs Dalloway, stream of consciousness is the primary, though not the exclusive mode of narration. Virginia Woolf builds her characters by representing their thoughts. In fact, the plot of the novel is constructed subjectively by the characters. Almost every scene of the novel intimately tracks the thoughts and impressions of one particular character. The narrative moves back and forth in time and in and out of the characters' minds. In order to illustrate the use of the technique, let me read out the opening passage of the novel. Mrs. Dalloway said she would buy the flowers herself, for Lucy had her work cut out for her. The doors would be taken off their hinges. Rumpelmayer's men were coming. And then, thought Clarissa Dalloway, what a morning, fresh as if issued to children on a beach. What a lark, what a plunge, for so it had always seemed to her, when with a little squeak of the hinges, which she could hear now, she had burst open the French windows and plunged at Burton into the open air. How fresh, how calm! Stiller than this, of course, the air was in the early morning, like the flap of a wave, the kiss of a wave, chill and sharp, and yet, for a girl of 18, as she then was, solemn, feeling as she did, standing there at the open window, that something awful was about to happen, looking at the flowers, at the trees with the smoke winding off them and the rooks rising, falling, standing and looking until Peter Walsh said, "Musing among the vegetables, was that it? I prefer men to cauliflowers." Was that it? He must have said it at breakfast one morning when she had gone out onto the terrace. Peter Walsh. He would be back from India one of these days, June or July, she forgot which, for his letters were awfully dull. It was his sayings one remembered, his eyes, his pocket knife, his smile, his grumpiness, and when millions of things had utterly vanished, how strange it was, a few sayings like this about cabbages. Mrs. Dalloway is not merely an exercise in technical innovation. The novel deals with many vital issues. The first of these issues may be summed up under the terms reality, existence, and contentment. The novel places a premium on the subjective experience of reality. In the representation of almost all her characters in Mrs. Dalloway, Virginia Woolf emphasizes private thoughts more than outward behavior or events in the life of characters. But life is also intersubjective. That is why Clarissa, Septimus, and Peter Walsh all endeavor to not only protect the privacy of their worlds, but also to reach out to others, to communicate. Love and contentment are so important in life. The characters' memories, reflections, and future plans deal with choices which may or may not result in fulfillment. Clarissa is known for efforts at arranging parties for others. Although these are part of her role as a member of the upper class society, they are also an attempt to bring people together and create some happiness. Death looms large on the horizon of the character's thoughts. So there is an attempt to achieve some kind of authenticity, meaning in life. The attempt of the character is to make everyday endeavors, interactions, and relationships meaningful. The novel Mrs. Dalloway also tells us a lot about the changing British society. In 1923, when the events of Mrs. Dalloway occur, rapid political and social changes were taking place in England. The conservative establishment and its oppressive values were on the decline. The characters of the novel, including Septimus, Clarissa, and Peter Walsh, are intensely aware of the failure of the empire as much as they are aware of their personal failures. In fact, there is a parallel between political and personal failures in the novel. Virginia Woolf's novels are often criticized for their exclusive attention on the upper classes and the neglect of the other classes. But she is intensely aware of class distinctions and their implications. Miss Kilman and Septimus hail from the working class. Their portraits have a strong class basis, especially in Miss Kilman's deprivation and her resentment at upper class lifestyle. The characters Sally Seton and Clarissa Dalloway symbolize the narcissism of bourgeois lifestyle. They do not know anything about the hunger and insecurity which is part and parcel of the life of working women. But even these women suffer from sexual and economic repression, which are a mark of patriarchal capitalist society. Thus, they also draw our attention to the problems of women. Though the Allies won the war, the casualties in the British Commonwealth were so huge that many ordinary Englishmen lost faith in the ideals that sustained the British Empire. A major theme in Mrs Dalloway is the emotional turmoil caused by the war. In depicting the misery of Septimus Warren Smith, Woolf provides a rare insight into shell shock. For Septimus, the ideals which were given by political elite as a rationale for the First World War are completely meaningless. Perhaps Virginia Woolf is suggesting that what is real is the suffering and trauma caused by war to the men at the battlefront. Septimus is a silently suffering victim of war. Finally, he gives up. The next major theme in Mrs Dalloway is mental illness and psychiatric practices. Let us bear in mind that Virginia Woolf herself suffered from severe psychological problems during her lifetime. Originally, the author had intended that, like Septimus, Clarissa also should commit suicide at the end of the novel. This shows that disappointment with life, trauma, and psychological problems are not isolated cases but widespread across classes and sexes. Through the character of Septimus, Virginia Woolf is able to mount strong criticism of not only the discourse of psychology but also actual treatment. So William Bradshaw and Dr. Holmes, the two people who treat Septimus, do not try to understand Septimus as a living human subject. They objectify him. They do not speak to him directly. They speak to him through his wife, Lucrezia. They insensitively dismiss his experiences. They do not respect him as an individual. They make no attempt to question either inherited cultural norms or the norms of their discipline, even to understand the misery of a shell shock victim. Perhaps Virginia Woolf is suggesting that closer social bonds and compassion can provide people with solace, happiness, and mental health. The last theme which we are going to discuss is marriage and sexuality. For both Sally Seton and Clarissa Dalloway, heterosexual marriage is a catastrophe, but they fondly remember the strong mutual attachment of their youth at Burton. But society has no place for alternative sexualities. Similarly, Septimus Warren Smith is haunted by the image of his dear friend Evans. Evans is described as being undemonstrative in the company of women. During the First World War and even during the Second, homosexuality was clandestinely practiced by soldiers.